welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah, right.
Hey everyone, it's really great to see you again for another G News podcast. My name is Jared Otto, and today we're going to be talking about choices we could make about the direction of our economy. And of course, everything's up for grabs. Nothing is necessarily pinned down. There are actual choices we could make. Joining me today, in his personal capacity, to talk more about the choices we could make about our economy is political and economic advisor Craig Renney, who I'd like to really welcome to the show. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Craig, I read that you first came to New Zealand in 2012 when David Cameron was the Prime Minister of the UK, and he just closed down the audit commission that you were working for. But before that, you were doing a lot of research, economic policy research in Europe and Ireland and in the UK at a time when you were seeing a huge amount of economic and social upheaval, including in your own hometown. So, what kind of things were you seeing in recession in small towns, and how did seeing the impacts on people shape your view about the choices that we could be making economically today?
Well, one of the things we saw in the UK, particularly the small town that I'm from, which is a tiny little coal mining village just north of Newcastle called Cramlington, in many of those towns around the UK, they hadn't actually recovered from the recessions of the 1980s. Those were recessions brought on by deindustrialization and by the stripping away of formerly heavy industries like coal, like steel, like shipbuilding. And much like New Zealand's experience in the 80s and 90s, those communities were just left to their own devices. They were just left to solve these problems on their own because the free hand of the market at the time would solve all of the problems that were in front of them. Now, of course, we know that doesn't work. But what we were doing was we're having a 30-year experiment in desperately going to prove it really, really, really didn't work. Now, the Blair government came along in 1997, and for all its faults elsewhere, it spent huge amounts of money regenerating and trying to deliver economic development in regions. At the end of that government in 2010, we had the GFC. We had the great financial crisis, the collapse of Lehman's. We saw, the banking sector brought to its knees, and these communities again essentially being brought to the point of saying, well, hang on, we had just started to get some jobs, we had just started to get some economic growth, and the rug was pulled underneath them. And the prescription from the then Conservative government was to repeat the prescription that we'd seen 30 years ago. And so we saw mass unemployment, we saw the cutting of public services, we saw the ending of many of the essential services that people were relying on, and as a consequence, there was a huge further and elongated recession, not only in those parts of the UK but right across the country. There's a really good study called the Glasgow study, which mapped the impacts on households of the recession and the policies post the GFC, and it found around 300,000 excess deaths in the UK as a consequence of those policy changes. So there's a range of things that we were seeing, but essentially it was just simply a repeat. We had taken a failed policy in the past, which is simply to allow markets to try and regenerate, allow markets to try and redevelop areas, and we were further casting those areas into the economic wilderness without any help, without any support. Now, when we looked overseas, we saw much better outcomes for communities. We saw much better outcomes for regions. And that was because the state had taken a much more active role in the redevelopment, in the reskilling, in the retooling of those economies. And as a consequence, their recessions were not only shallower, the outcomes for families and for communities were much better. And at an aggregate level, at an economic level, those countries were pulling ahead of the UK in terms of their economy. So to me, it seemed really obvious there were, there was a fork in the road. We could either head in one direction or head in the other direction. And unfortunately, the UK spent a long time essentially heading in the opposite direction to the direction it probably should have headed in.
Okay. Well, you came out to New Zealand and you took a job in Treasury and Housing, I understand. And then you worked for Sir Bill English and for a period of time, and you also worked at MB and at the Reserve Bank. But then you became an economic advisor for Grant Robertson. And while you were doing that, you discovered a $4 billion hole in a Paul Goldsmith budget. And but probably more importantly, you worked with Grant on the first wellbeing budget that we had in New Zealand. And that was a choice that New Zealand made to look at, to care about the well-being of people, not just GDP. Why is the well-being of people important, and that we don't just look at our success by measuring GDP growth?
Well, hopefully, the reason why well-being and welfare of individuals is important should hopefully go without saying. But this is economics; it needs saying. The original inventor of GDP, an economist called Simon Kuznets, when he invented it, said this is one of the most meaningless statistics I've ever invented. Because it looked at a range of things. It looked at all the things that we bought, all the investments that we made, all the government spending, and it added it all together. And it didn't tell you anything about the quality of life of the individuals inside that country. And the famous dictum in economics goes that I can break a window and I create GDP, but if I don't break a window, I don't create GDP. So there are lots of we look at GDP as a number because it tells us interesting things about how much economic activity there is, but we focus our policy settings on increasing well-being and increasing good economic outcomes for individuals and for families, because that's actually what's important in economics, not a slightly arbitrary number that gets revised and moved around, because it can go up, it can go down, it can go sideways. But actually, if individuals' well-being isn't improving, and certainly we saw that during the 80s and the 90s, not only in New Zealand, but in the UK and in lots of developed countries. We saw rising GDP, but also rising inequality, rising child poverty, rising poor outcomes for working people. So if we just look at the GDP number, we would be seduced into thinking everything was okay. But actually, the important thing is, how are we delivering a good life, a good quality of life, and an economy that supports that better life?
Yes. Okay. Well, when you were doing all this work in New Zealand, the Conservatives were still in power back in the UK, and they were running a playbook which was pretty much straight out of those Tufton Street think tanks, and that included austerity budgets, much like what we are seeing in New Zealand from Nicola Willis at the
Yep.
moment. And so, was there ever any evidence that austerity can help us get out of a recession, or that privatization could do something like improve our health system?
No, and to be honest, all of the economic evidence, the empirical evidence, when we look at the real world examples around the world rather than the kind of theorized universes that you can get in economics textbooks, austerity not only doesn't work, it's counterproductive. It actually leads to poorer outcomes for communities, for individuals, and it makes getting out of a recession and getting back to growth harder. To give you a really simple example, the economy is made up of four parts: consumption, investment, government, and exports. That's it. It is simplest. If consumption's going down because people are losing their jobs, businesses don't invest because they don't want to spend any money. That means tax falls, so the government has less to spend. So we rely upon exports, but often you have a global export downturn because the economies around the world are downturning. Something has to stop. And so we increase our spending on the G part, the government part, because we start to rebuild the economy. Increased government investment leads to more jobs. More jobs leads to more money in pockets. More money in pockets leads to businesses investing. leads to higher productivity, which leads to higher tax. All of a sudden, we've got growth again.
Okay.
The challenge we have is austerity does the opposite. It digs us down further. And as a consequence, it makes it harder and harder to get out of the economic hole we're in. And it simply exacerbates the economic inequalities and the problems that we often have in a country.
Right. Well, when this government, came into power, just before it came into power, it has a number of choices, and it chose to give a tax cut at the worst possible time in the economic cycle. It also borrowed more than in any other budget since the peak of COVID. And what I heard anyway was a huge amount of talk about how government spending was a major driver of inflation, and how Labor had sprayed money everywhere, and
Hmm.
that there were 6 years of economic vandalism. But in actual fact, what was happening was we were having a global pandemic, and all central banks were printing money so that we could spend some money on wage subsidies to kind of keep people going through a lockdown when we didn't have a vaccine. And we were supporting businesses with business support payments. So this is a bit hypothetical, but we don't often hear what would have happened if we hadn't spent that money. And that was the big part of the money on wage subsidies and supporting businesses.
Well, the evidence we have from the New Zealand medical journals and from the collected evidence today from the Ministry of Health is that the package of support and the fact that we went into COVID lockdowns saved around 20 to 30,000 lives in New Zealand. Now, I'm an economist. I can put a value on that. I can start putting some numbers next to that. But we really shouldn't need mathematical numbers in order to work out saving 20 to 30,000 lives is a good thing, full stop. Two, we saved businesses. We saw unemployment fall to the lowest rate since the 1st of September 1986. I know that date because it's when we started collecting unemployment statistics on this basis. We saw an economy that was not in recession. We kept being told we were in recession, but actually, we were not in recession at all up until the very last 6 months of this government, not of the previous government. We were growing at 2.5% GDP when the government fell. Employment reached highs that we haven't seen. There were plenty of things to celebrate. Now, if we hadn't taken those decisions, we could have looked like the UK. We could have seen many more deaths. We could have seen a much more difficult economic situation to get out of. We could have looked like the US, where there were around 250,000 COVID-related deaths. There were more deaths from COVID in the United States than there were as a consequence of the Civil War.
Wow.
Now, in terms of what happened in New Zealand, we were to some extent protected by the fact that we had a 3-hour international moat around us. But when COVID came here, the government had a responsibility to respond, and it did. And to my mind, and certainly to the experts' minds, it delivered one of the best COVID responses anywhere on the planet. Of course, that involved spending money, but as you said, reserve banks around the world were having to respond to rising prices. Now, as much as the New Zealand government is a powerful actor, it is not responsible for global oil prices. It is not responsible for global shipping prices. Global shipping prices rose 1,100%. That's 1,100% in 1 year. We saw insurance prices rocket to get goods around the world. We saw a range of other prices increase. Those are always going to feed themselves into price increases. Now, when they fed themselves out, we've seen what we have now, which is inflation returning to normal. And that's not only true in New Zealand, it's true pretty much else around the rest of the world. So the extent to which the government spending at the time was responsible is pretty thin, to be deadly honest. And and if it was true in New Zealand, it should be true around the rest of the world, but actually we've seen much better outcomes in some jurisdictions, like Spain, for example, that spent A, more money, but B, kept delivering support rather than pulling the rug, as this government has in many areas.
Yeah. Look, I have heard a huge amount of what I think is wrongful propaganda from the current government about who's to blame and also who is taking credit for inflation coming down. At one point, I remember the Prime Minister going on a local Q&A program and being unable to actually state, extra spending, and it didn't add up to much. And you had the Reserve Bank saying it was small beer, it was negligible. But do you think what we have seen is that due to sort of a slightly feeble pushback, really, the vast, portions of New Zealand have been hoodwinked or brainwashed into thinking that government spending was the main culprit here locally, when it's just not true?
I think many people have been taught that essentially the government was responsible for inflation, that somehow all of this discretion, this choice to spend money, particularly on the poor, particularly on those on benefits, has somehow led to a wild increase in inflation. That's not only simply not true, um, it's not true anywhere in the world.
Mm,
Um, um, we've seen falls in inflation around the world as global commodity prices fell away. Now they all link up. We saw New Zealand be the second fastest. It was the second country in the world to respond to interest rate increases, just after the Norwegian central bank, and our rate of increases were amongst the fastest anywhere in the world. Now,
yeah,
that you would therefore believe would reduce prices more quickly. But in Australia, which saw less of an increase, you saw um, in prices come down more quickly. Australia was also spending a lot of money on its COVID response. What instead we saw was essentially New Zealand being a victim of its isolated geography, the fact that it imports a lot of goods and services, the fact that we had a central bank that essentially overcooked it on the interest rate hiking end, and now we're having to live with the consequences of that.
right. Well, I'd see also this huge resistance at the moment from uh, Prime Minister, particularly when he's in Parliament, to answer questions, about these kind of topics. And the typical response I'm seeing is he'll say something like, "With the greatest of respect, I won't be lectured by that person over there from, say, Labour or whoever, because they mismanaged the economy." And it all comes back down to these kind of what I think are factually incorrect myths. That there was, you know, there wasn't sort of a world where there were external, inflation being imported into New Zealand. It was all the government. Um, and what do you make of that kind of carry on that we're seeing in Parliament at the moment?
Well, that they require that myth because their economic policies aren't working. Um, we're in recession. We're in the steepest recession outside of COVID that we've had since 1991. We've had the fastest fall in employment since 1991. Government spending fell at the fastest rate since the last Ruth Richardson budget.
Mm,
Right?
yeah,
Their economic prescription isn't working. Therefore, they're looking for reasons to say blame somebody else. Right? And
yeah,
and we've had a litany of reasons why it's not working, why the economy is not growing. Road cones, free school meals, woke banks. None of these things are true, but they're useful sideshows from the real fact, which is that unemployment is rising, so consumers have their hands in their pockets. They have their hands in their pockets, so businesses don't invest. Businesses don't invest. We don't create jobs. We don't create tax. We keep going round and round and round the same circle, hoping for something to solve that problem. Which is why we have an investor forum in March this year on the 13th, 14th, and we're desperately hoping some overseas investors bail us out of the situation in which we've created, um, and because we've failed to invest. And there's never a better time to invest in the essential things that you need as a country when there's no work in construction. There are
Mm,
13,000 fewer workers in construction in New Zealand than this time last year. Now,
wow.
we all know where they are. They're in Australia, right? There's approximately a 30% fall, 27% from memory, fall in the number of houses that have been consented from this time last year.
Mm,
The population isn't getting any smaller. In fact, we had a housing shortage beforehand, so why aren't we building housing? Because demand has fallen off, because people are uncertain, because people are losing their jobs, and we can keep playing this game, or we can invest. And the excuses, for want of a better phrase, that the current government keeps putting up are essentially just that. They're just an attempt to hide from the fact that their current prescription, which is cut, deliver tax cuts for higher income earners, cross your fingers and hope house prices turn back up, isn't an economic plan. That's just hoping that we return to the kind of economy we had in 2014, 2015, where we sold houses and coffee to each other and hoped the dairy markets continued.
I have been quite aware that there's this sort of almost like a complete sort of mythological charade going on here, and that, for example, before the 2023 election, we heard a huge amount from the Prime Minister about a $250 a fortnight tax cut for
Mm.
those households that had a couple of children, average family, etc. For 5 weeks or so, that was like a cool story. And we heard it all the time. It was on television, I think it was 9 or 10 times. And sometimes it was per fortnight, sometimes it was per week. But suddenly you came out and busted that one like massively, and it was great to see because only 3,000 households were eligible out of all those hundreds of thousands of households, and suddenly people realize, oh well, really this isn't such a great deal. And I think it's only 553 households at the moment that are actually on that top rate.
Yeah,
So sometimes you sort of feel, well, I sort of feel, why does Craig Renney have to tell everybody? Why does he have to do the thinking? I mean, shouldn't other people also be calling this kind of thing out a little bit sooner? How do you feel about that?
well, it keeps me in a job, so I'm quite happy with it. I can pay the mortgage for this house as a consequence of these sorts of things. So I'm not going to complain too hard. And it's great fun. I get to do a fantastic job for a living, which is be the economist for the CTU. I'm blessed in that sense. But you're not wrong. The lack of engagement with numbers in particular, and with
Mm,
claims that are made. The other week we had a claim about the number of violent crimes that had fallen, which didn't
yeah,
hold up to any scrutiny at all. Yesterday, we had an announcement about the number of new nurses, the number of new doctors that would be made available, new GP practices, and $285 million over 3 years of new spending. Only it's not new spending; it's spending from the original budget. We don't
ah,
actually know. We don't even know where it comes from. It's just magic money, and so there's a range of these claims that sort of fall apart when you start to look at them. And in reality, it sort of begs for the kinds of institution that we see overseas, where we see independent officers of budget responsibility or financial institutions that can look at these things and say no or yes or whatever.
yeah,
Um, um, but in terms of the the current government, it has at times stretched credibility about its claims. It's certainly stretched credibility about how it's going to pay, how it was going to pay for its tax cuts, which have involved borrowing around $12 billion to pay for $14 billion of tax cuts.
mm,
It stretched credibility when it said that we could make that without cuts to frontline services, when of
yeah,
course we've all seen cuts to frontline services. The PSA survey earlier this week showed that many frontline workers in health were feeling burnt out, were feeling the challenge of those cuts. You know, um, there's a real credibility challenge there, and it's one of the things that I think as a country we should be calling out more. Is hang on a second, stop. And let's ask ourselves the question: is that a credible claim? How do we prove it, and how do we show it? And that requires, more people to do the job, the kind of job that I do, which is to take apart the numbers and make sure that they make sense.
Speaking of health, I mean, one of the first things that I saw this government do was they could have chosen to save 5,000 lives by sticking with the Smoke-Free Amendment Act
Mm.
that was going in, but instead um, they seemed to side with the tobacco industry and ended up hooking. They did away with that law, which would have been a big saving in downstream healthcare costs for the country. Not to mention all the lives that would be saved, and somehow or another they were able to come up with $211 million worth of tax cuts for a big tobacco company, Philip Morris, while at the same time not being able to pay out on nurses and their pay equity claims. And I think what we've seen is, in real terms, a per capita decrease in health funding. I mean, have you got any comment to make about that?
Well, I mean, the it's a 4.5% per person real terms cut in health funding from last year. Um, and so you go, okay. Well, I mean, were we spending too much money in health? We absolutely weren't spending too much money in health. Were we spending money badly? Well, if we were spending money badly, that doesn't mean you cut spending. It just means that you rearrange the spending so you get more value for money for the
Mm,
spending. Um, so essentially, you've got to say, well, this must be a choice.
yeah,
This essentially is a choice to cut this spending and put it somewhere else. It's a choice to have cut health spending in real terms and give landlords $3 billion of a tax cut. It's a choice to cut welfare payments by indexing them to CPI rather than to wages. That puts 13,000 more children into material poverty. But that's okay, because then I can give $1.5 billion to tobacco companies as a
yeah,
consequence of it. So there are a bunch of choices that are made on the way through here, and you have to ask yourself the question: if I pull all those choices together, what picture does it draw? What kind of moral compass does it demonstrate? Of the government that's in front of us, might choose, for example, to increase the minimum wage by less than inflation for 2 years running, taking more than $1,000 a year out of the pockets in real terms of minimum wage workers.
yeah.
I might choose to suspend the building of new schools or the repair of schools, and sort of fudge exactly how I'm going to pay for that in the long run. But that's okay, because kids' schools can be too nice, right? Right? So there's a bunch of choices that this government has essentially made, and in demonstrating those choices, right, it's shown you its values. There's a famous Joe Biden quote, which is, "Don't don't tell me your values. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you your values."
That's
And
great.
and that essentially is what this government has done with its choices.
This government's made it much more expensive to get your prescriptions. It's made it more expensive for families to, take public transport around. It's actually killed off the EV market pretty much entirely,
Mm.
and we hear a lot from them about how they're going to fix the economy, but they're fixing it for somebody. It's just who is benefiting from the fix, and my question would be, are the poor in this country just going to get poorer and poorer and poorer unless we make some pretty serious policy interventions?
I think your point is well made, Jared. These things aren't inevitable. They're not some kind of night. It's not like coastal erosion, where it doesn't matter what you do, it's going to happen,
Mm,
right? Right? These are choices. We can make other choices and get different outcomes, get better outcomes. We can choose not to allow the number of children who are living in poverty, because we've changed the rules around child poverty, to go up by 17,000.
mm, mm.
Right? We can choose to have school meals that are actually edible, that actually aren't burnt plastic. You know, we can choose to make sure that we're looking after our elderly residents, with that we're making sure that we're increasing the various benefits that are available to them. We can choose to insulate homes properly. The government's currently consulting on removing the home insulation standards, lest somebody get too hot. Um,
Gosh. Yeah.
there are a range of things that we can choose to do differently, and we can choose to make long-term investments that actually will grow the economy, rather than simply trying to find the next sugar rush
Mm.
that will deliver some growth or some spending in the hope that that kickstarts the economy again. Because the real challenge that's in front of us is, between now and 2026, we may well start to see some growth in the economy again, but there will have been a huge amount of completely unnecessary damage on the way through.
Speaking of the unnecessary damage, I'm aware that you were one of 15 independent economists from all over the political spectrum who contributed to writing an open letter to the government, suggesting that they were actually, by their policies, making the recession that we're in longer and deeper, and urged them to have another look at
Mm.
that. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that letter and what was in it?
Well, I don't know if you know how hard it is to get 15 economists to agree to anything. We're a bit like cats. If very, very famously, the American president Herbert Hoover, when he was asked if he could have anything, what would it be? And he said, "I'd like a one-handed economist," because every economist he'd ever met had said, "Well, on the one hand you get this, but on the other hand you get that." Um, and uh, and and so getting 15 economists to agree is enormous. Getting them all to write a letter to the prime minister is even larger. But we all agreed that the prescription that had been put in front of the country of cuts, of reducing investment, of minimizing the things that we thought would deliver the productivity growth, support employment, support household spending, all of those things would be enormously counterproductive. And I'm not here to tell you I told you so, and history will judge the winner in the future. But we're in a recession now that arguably we didn't need to be in.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
we're struggling to find the money for essential investments like the Cook Strait Ferry.
yeah,
But we're struggling to find money for essential investments like Dunedin Hospital, like Nelson Hospital. Auckland, because of its population growth over the past 10 years, should have around 2 new hospitals. Doesn't have either of them. Um,
speak, yeah,
and as a consequence, the letter was an attempt to get the government to say it's not too late. Let's put politics to one side for just 1 second and say, if we change track, not only would we all be better off, but we would have shortened the length and depth of the recession that's in front of us.
great. Speaking of population growth, when the population in New Zealand increases, there's a investment gap created. I heard you speak about this once. Could you just elaborate for our audience what that is about?
Yeah. So the Infrastructure Commission, which is a government body, did a piece of work a couple of years ago looking at, do we have a sense of the all of the public assets that we should have in the country as a consequence of population, demographic, and other needs. As our standard of living goes up, we expect new and different things, and some things like telegraph poles become irrelevant, but the internet becomes more important, and so you change your infrastructure needs. Its finding was that over the past 30 years, we had seen the growth of approximately a $104 billion infrastructure gap. And that represented schools, hospitals, roads, police stations, prisons, everything that you can imagine that should be there and are not. And they're not because essentially we've chosen not to make those investments. We've chosen instead to create a liability for the future. And so when your viewers think about debt, right, they should think about our debt and our liability as two sides of the same coin. So that $104 billion gap is just debt we haven't put on the balance sheet yet to pay for things.
Right.
So our debt numbers can look artificially lower than they should do. It's just because we haven't paid for the stuff that we should have paid for. Um, and so when someone tells you we can't increase debt, we can't put debt up because your children and your grandchildren will be paying back this debt. Well, if you're not solving that liability, you're asking your children and your grandchildren to pay for things you should have built. And not only do they have to pay for it, they don't get the benefits of those assets existing on the way through. And so the real challenge in this country is how do we get over that gap? How do we close that gap? Because that gap grows. So it's $104 billion now, but over the next 20, 30 years, it grows to around $200 billion,
Mm.
which is
So
which is
this,
about half of GDP.
yeah, so this focus on GDP and debt to GDP ratios and bringing them down, um, we hear a bit of talk that maybe it's time to actually loosen up about that. And do you have a position on that at the moment? Like that area?
I do. I mean, the debt to GDP ratios can have value if you're trying to do something specific with spending. If you're trying to create a fiscal strategy for a particular purpose, but the reality is that let's have a thought experiment. Let's say you've got debt to GDP ratio of 40% of GDP. Fine. Let's say you're at that ceiling. Now, let's say you, Jared, could have you have a project that will cost $1 that will deliver huge benefits to a huge range of people.
Mm,
Would I borrow $1 above my threshold to deliver those benefits? Of course I would. Be
yeah,
mad not to. And
exactly.
so it tells you something about the value of the ceiling. And
Mm,
it might have signaling value. It might say something to the markets. It might say something to government departments. That's what you're prepared to borrow up to. But every investment should be investigated and established on its own merit.
right,
And when you're making an assessment of whether to borrow money or not borrow money, you do that based upon the value for money of the investment opportunity that's in front of you, not on the basis of some arbitrary debt ceiling or some arbitrary number that's somewhere, because that has much less value than the actual potential outcome that you might get from the investment.
right. So another one of these kind of choices that comes back down to these sorts of looking at the evidence and looking at what the benefits are. Um, the national government did away with the ability for workers to agree fair pay agreements in sectors where there was a race to the bottom, and they also returned us to 90-day trials. And just my question is just basically, what was the evidence that those choices made by National were better for businesses? And alternatively, what was the evidence that fair pay agreements are actually better for workers?
Um, the evidence that this would benefit, that the reduction, the removal of fair pay agreements, the reinstallation of 90-day trials, that the sort of the increasing the minimum wage by less than inflation, the evidence for that was vibes. That was it. There was no, there's no statistical evidence. It was we spoke to the business community and they
Yeah,
liked it, and so therefore we did it.
wow.
It was vibes based analysis, and as a consequence, you know, workers, through no fault of their own, found their ability to collectively organize and then to deliver better outcomes for themselves, to manage simple things, health and safety,
Mm,
leave,
mm,
right, a range of other things. The ability to do that, it all went. Their ability to do that stopped. The ability to not be fired after 89 days because your employer just suddenly says, I have no work for you, that went. All the evidence from the Treasury, from the government's own research, says 90-day trials had no benefit to anyone except employers in making it easier to fire workers.
mm,
It didn't encourage investment. It didn't encourage new employment. It specifically didn't encourage new employment from people who were previously unemployed. It didn't encourage new employment for younger people. All the reasons that were supposed to be thrown out. Increasing the minimum wage, again, didn't encourage more people to be in work. It just simply made it cheaper to hire someone. and pay them less and exploit them a little bit more.
Mm.
So there was no evidence that any of these changes have actually benefited anyone. And in countries that have these better protections, they have a stronger economy. They have
Mm.
better wages. Australia has national awards, which is what we were working towards in fair pay agreements. The average worker in Australia is paid approximately 25% more than the average New Zealand worker. They work few. They work approximately 100 hours on average a year less than the average New Zealand worker. Their cost of living is lower. Right? They have a stronger, better economy. They're more productive.
Mm.
I can I can point you to some of the most productive workers in the world are in France, which has national collective awards. In Germany, in Denmark, they all have systems to support tripartite systems to encourage bargaining, to encourage employers and employees to come together. It leads to better outcomes, not just for employers, but for the economy generally. They spend less on welfare. So the evidence to support their removal in New Zealand, their evidence to support the reductions in the ability of workers to engage with employers, it was simply vibes based analysis. There was no empirical or other data to support actually why we were installing that as a policy.
That's stunning. In Budget 24, we saw Nicola Willis index beneficiaries to wages rather than inflation after the Children's Commissioner had said that indexing benefits to inflation was the greatest single thing that we'd done to help um, with child poverty, etc.
Mm.
And Nicola Willis, I'd seen her in the press being reported that it was a great shame that the minimum wage had gone up so much. Um, and this government only gave a minimum wage, a really, really pitiful amount in
Yeah.
budget for. What did you actually think about that?
Well, it's one of these things where again, government has choices. Government can make different decisions, and again, it demonstrates its values through those choices. The choice to put more to knowingly put more children in poverty. I I hate talking about child poverty because it makes me angry and upset. It makes me angry and upset that there are 156,000 kids in this country who live in material poverty. That means they don't have um, you know uh, good shoes. It means they don't have a winter coat. It means they live in cold, damp housing. It means they regularly go without meals, or their family regularly goes without medical or dental treatment. Um, uh, for in a country as wealthy as New Zealand, that's a sin. Now, how you can then knowing that, then choose to say, "I'm going to make that worse,"
Yeah,
right?
and they talk about productivity and how we need to kind of get that going, and but the solutions are always sort of like vague, long-term things. Education and uh, grow the economy just at at a macro level, and it's but at the same time they're making choices to sort of stimulate and incentivize unproductive aspects of our economy, like all these housing investors. What do you think about this obsession with unproductive incentives, like giving tax cuts to landlords? you
Well,
know or,
it's not even just that. So right now, the government's currently talking about reducing corporation tax.
yeah.
So the tax paid by businesses. Now, fine, if you think that will lead to any kind of increased production or any kind of increased employment. But again, all the evidence around the world tells us that it makes very little difference. Trump reduced American corporate tax rates from 35% to 21%. GDP did exactly zero. It did nothing during its period in time. All that happened was it just enriched a very small number of individuals who were making money from those profits, um, and made already stratospherically bad inequality in the US worse.
Yeah.
Now, is that the prescription that we want to then see in New Zealand? Because to me, the answer, if you really genuinely cared about productivity, the big problem of productivity in New Zealand is labour productivity. We have chronically poor labour productivity in New Zealand. Why do we have chronically poor labour productivity in New Zealand? Skills. A workforce that at times can be chronically ill. The number of people who are on job seekers' health and disability claims has gone up 47% over the past 5 years. So we need to be investing money in the health system, particularly primary health. We need to be investing money in the education system, particularly supporting workforce development. So, not only looking at the kids who are entering the workforce, but your existing workforce and saying, how can we make sure they have the right skills and the tools to the jobs? We can't get workers in some places because the house prices are so high, and some workers can't leave where they live because their house prices are so low they could never afford to move somewhere else. So, how do we solve housing as a means of delivering productivity growth in the country and stop the overinvestment in housing that we
Yep.
see in New Zealand in comparison again to jurisdictions overseas? And there is a fairly obvious answer here, Jared, which is New Zealand is almost unique in the developed world in having no capital gains tax system.
Yeah, we we hear about the um, the way in which capital gains tax is now talked about by boardroom people as something that we should do. It's a fairness thing, um, in terms of people making money out of selling capital. Um, only paying, I think the IRD said it was 9% on
Mm.
average, and the worker paying something closer to 23 or 24% on average. So there was a big sort of equity issue there, but there was also just a normality issue, wasn't there? Because we're an outlier, like you say, in the OECD. I mean, it's normal to have some kind of capital gains tax, but of course, we've got this government that's arguing, oh, you don't tax your way out of a recession. They've got these kind of lines like that.
Mm.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think so. So, for example, the government's recent "Going for Growth" document
Mm,
highlighted two countries as examples of places that said, "Let's have a look at this and see what's going on." One of which was Singapore, which looks nothing like New Zealand at all. Has some frankly terrible labour standards and a very very unequal society, but also has a capital gains tax system. The other country it said to look at was Denmark. Denmark has tax levels that would cause rioting in the streets in New Zealand, but also has a capital gains tax system and has a fully tripartite economic development system. So its domestic economic development takes place in conjunction with workers and employers. Um, these are all things the government has ended in this country upon taking office. Um, and so, if we genuinely want to look at those countries and say, well, how have they worked? How have they developed? You can't just cherry pick little bits here and there and say, we like that bit, therefore we'll do that bit, and we like that bit, and we'll do that bit. You have to look at their full ecosystems.
yeah,
And I fear what the government is doing is saying, I like that bit over there, and I'll pick that bit, and I like that bit there. And it's not actually taking the full context in, which is that often they will have settings that either make no sense in New Zealand or would actually be completely counter to the current government's ethos.
yeah, exactly. When it comes to school lunches and the way that the government has missed its child poverty targets, um, we're seeing a bit of a public backlash at the moment, actually. Right now, today
Mm.
in particular, the Marmite sandwiches and everything. Um, and the fact that we've got 156 thousand kids in material deprivation, um, and it's their first meal of the day sometimes, these lunches at schools, like for some of the children. And you know it's basically slop that they're serving up this terrible looking food that most of the kids don't like. Um, so you know, we, I don't know, I don't think it was perfect, but didn't we have a better system in place, like a more community based, schools based, local system of delivering lunches? This is just one of these choices that we've made, and it seems to be about saving $130 million, but look at the damage that it's already doing in schools.
Well, it's not only that. Imagine being a child and being served that, what signal does that send to that child about their value? What signal does that send to that child about their place in New Zealand society?
Mm.
Is it that, they're worthwhile, that they're wanted, that, they're respected, that we want them to do well, or that they're a burden that we're going to minimize the costs on,
Yeah,
because we think actually, you're simply another you're simply another welfare recipient for whom we're going to try and minimize our expenditure. And free school meals again are again another example of the choice framework that's in front of us. We had a mechanism for delivering school meals. It was working, certainly working much more effectively than the previous system. It needed investment, certainly. Should it be expanded further? Absolutely. Would help tackle a multitude of ills that take place in the country. Um, but instead, the government thought that it could reduce those costs, minimize its burden as it saw it, and it didn't actually care about the outcomes
I think,
because
yeah, it doesn't care. Another example here was Budget 24. There was no TAG contingency for the cancer drugs for 1,000 people that were going to possibly die. So this is a life and death um, oversight here. This is like people are dying, and you're an afterthought. This is what I saw anyway. And surely we could be making better choices about health in general. You've got this talk about a record level of spending in health. That's a
yeah,
complete load of bollocks. And
it, it,
it's effectively 12 years, like a whole bunch of multi-year layered spending, and it's the case that we've got GP clinics closing their books over not having enough capitation spending. So and we've got hospitals worrying about patient safety, and it seems as if it's the cost of everything and the value of nothing.
nothing. It's a great. That's exactly the line, Jared, that I use when I talk to audiences. Right?
Mm,
We know the cost of everything, right? But we know the value of nothing. Let me give you an example of what that means. At the last budget, we spent $30 million over 4 years on additional security in A&E departments. So more security guards for A&E departments, and many A&E departments will need security. No complaints. We certainly don't want frontline staff having to deal with particularly difficult clients on a Saturday night in urban areas. We spent $20 million on new doctors and new nurses. So we spent more on security guards than we did on medical staff.
it's a shocker.
Right? Now, I put it to you that we'd need fewer security guards if people were seen faster because we had more medical staff. Again,
Yeah,
it's that sense of choice
if they'd seen
where
GP, they wouldn't be in the hospital. That kind of thing too.
it's that
Yeah.
sense of choice. And again, nothing demonstrates that more than the government's choices around boot camps.
Oh yeah, and
Right?
that.
So the number of children in boot camps, 10 children in boot camps. Yeah. The cost of the first boot camp round is $4.1 million, which means each child costs $410,000 for its 12-week boot camp experience. I could pick that child up in a limo. Let's say it lived in Palmerston North, and I could drive it to Wellington. I could then fly it first class from Wellington um, to London Heathrow. I could pick them up in a limo and drive them to Windsor, at which point I would deposit them outside the steps of Eton, the public school, the private school in the UK. I could pay for a full year's free prescription to Eton. I could give them $1,000 a week in spending money just to make sure they weren't left behind. At the end of that year, I could pick them up in a limo, and I could drive them and I could fly them home first class, then drive them home in the limo, and then I could give them $200,000 in cash, and I'd still be better off than any single one of those boot camp places.
Wow, that's amazing.
Choices.
Yeah.
We choose to look macho on crime, which doesn't do anything. we know the latest data is that 8 or 9 of the 10 children who were in the boot camp have reoffended.
Mm.
Or we could actually choose to tackle the problems that are really in front of us. Instead, the government chooses the slogan rather than actually the problem.
Another example to me was we had a dry hydrological year last year, and we had gentailers, charging like wounded bulls, and manufacturers, particularly mills in small towns around New Zealand, went belly up because they just couldn't afford it. But that meant that there were hundreds of people working in small towns, who are dads, and
Mhm.
husbands and wives who were feeding children, and they suddenly don't have a job in a small town, and there's no other jobs. And the government had a choice to step in and help or just stand there and watch. And it's that kind of choice, like, what could have been done? What more could have been done? But we didn't see anything done.
Well, certainly didn't. And one of the things that, again, overseas jurisdictions have done is to look at how do we deliver a just transition. So we know those jobs may not be around forever,
Yeah.
but how can I maintain employment for those individuals so that the scarring effects
Mm.
of long-term unemployment don't visit themselves on those households and on those communities? And again, this isn't uncharted territory for New Zealand or indeed many other countries around the world. We can all point to former mill towns or forestry towns or meatwork towns around New Zealand that have been affected by economic change and have never fully recovered
Mm.
from that change. We know if we simply turn the lights off, what happens. But we also know what happens if we make interventions that allow for a more gradual change, that allow for a more organized change, that allow communities to reorganize themselves. We get better outcomes, not only for those workers, but for communities and for the government. It costs less money for us. But instead, because we choose not to make those investments, we choose to buy the bad outcomes that comes with that failure to invest.
So the next two budgets, to me, they look incredibly austere. $2.4 billion spending, limited envelopes. Surely, that's a bit inflexible the way I see it. Anyway, do you have a view on what
Well,
what?
it's worse. Yeah, it's worse than that, Jared, because we don't have $2.4 billion. Right, so $2.4 billion, as you say, is the operating allowance, which for some of your listeners is the new money every year the government gets to spend.
Mm.
Um, but $1.4 billion of that has already been pre-committed for health.
Yeah,
So there's $1 billion left.
right.
But we've already pre-committed about $300 million of that. So there's $700 million left. Only there's not, because every year we need to put money aside to pay for the cost of living changes inside education. We have more kids, they need more classrooms, they need so on, so on, and so forth. Right? That means after we've taken that away, we have approximately $1 to $200 million of real new money, not $2.4 billion, $1 to $200 million. Now, that means we're baking in cuts year after year after year
Yeah,
because we simply haven't put enough money on the table. Now, to give you some sense of the scale, $2.4 billion, we were spending more in new spending during the Helen Clark governments than we were today.
wow, that's amazing.
And that's with inflation on top between Helen's government and now.
This has got to be getting real close to being called austerity to me.
Well,
Like right
yeah,
down.
and as a consequence, we're saying, well, okay, well, we're choosing to make cuts. Those cuts then lead to reduced services, reduced outcomes, leads to a loss of confidence. We then end up back in the situation we were right at the beginning of this conversation, where we end up in this negative spiral
Yeah,
in terms of the economy.
negative feedback loop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're also, looking at some pretty big rate increases coming soon for a lot of people in different regions. And some of that's driven by water costs and roads, etc. However, it's just this idea that, we could have possibly done a bit better in terms of the balance sheet that we use than the current affordable water schemes. I'm not sure exactly how much this all contributes to the rates increases we're seeing. But do you have any thoughts on what we could have done better, what choices we could have made around rates?
Well, certainly, one of the things we could have done is had a better conversation with local government, and said, how do we actually get alongside you and work with you to understand what the needs are in your area, and then have 30, 40 year long plans to deliver the change that we need. Now, we don't have the capacity inside the civil engineering or the construction sector in New Zealand right now to deliver that scale of change. So the only actor who can do that is the Crown.
Mm,
So we used to have that. It was called the Ministry of Works.
mm,
So there are plenty of opportunities for the Crown to be investing because it has a 30, 40 year pipeline of, if you pardon the pun, of work just in water alone. And that would help reduce costs for everyone.
We're starting to see this situation with deregulation on steroids, basically, coming this year with the Overseas Investment Act being a target, and we've seen David Seymour's regulation agency. And, you know, there's quite a lot of concern that we're seeing this libertarian values being, come to the fore in the way that decisions around regulations are going to be um, lobbied, for example, and, there's a whole lot of issues there about power and framing up things, and the ACT Party being able to get in first and having all its people in there and
Mm.
its agency. Um, and we've got a lot of talk about foreign direct investment helping us and benefiting us, but hasn't deregulation or unbridled bridled deregulation been one of the major causes of big financial crises, in the history of the world? And we've seen just they deregulate things, and next thing you know, we don't know what's happening anymore. That kind
Well,
of
it's not. It's not just financial. Financial is the kind of very obvious example. Many New Zealanders will be sitting in houses that were affected by weather tightness,
mm, mm,
which essentially was a deregulation of a standard that existed on building materials. Um,
mm,
Many of them will have been affected by by the standard and by the savings and loans instruments in the 90s.
mm,
Many of them will have been affected if they lived in Havelock North by the failure to to enact existing regulations. So you can have regulations, but if no one's there to enforce them,
mm,
how does that work? We've spent approximately $1 billion tackling one disease, Mycoplasma bovis, in cattle, um, uh, um, caused essentially by lax regulation applications around national animal transports. So it's not only the failure to deliver existing regulations, the rolling back of regulations. It's the failure to properly value why we have regulations in the first place, and the failure to understand that while some people might find it annoying, many of these regulations exist in order to protect us from longer term evils, and
mm.
nothing demonstrates that better to me than the terrible health and safety statistics we have in New Zealand. We're a country that kills 17 workers a week as a consequence of their work. Every 15 minutes, we injure a worker so badly they've got to spend more than 5 days away from their work. So far we've been talking for about an hour, Jared. So that's
Yeah.
4 workers who've been injured so badly at work they've got to spend more than a week away from their work. We have a live case right now where we've got a product engineered stone, which is banned in Australia, which is killing workers in New Zealand from silicosis. Regulations have their place, and certainly sometimes we should be making sure that we're optimizing the regulations that we have. No one wants bad regulations, but that's not the same thing as simply just removing all regulations and hoping things turn out for the best, because they don't, and it's working people, it's communities who pay the price for that hope.
Yes, I think people are quite concerned about the deregulation that's coming this year. When it comes to neoliberal policies, is what I understand neoliberalism to be founded on is four main kind of areas. One is deregulation, another is austerity, another is financialization, and another is privatizing. And, we must have learned, I think, looking around the world, quite a bit about how neoliberalism hasn't really worked. It's a kind of a political order that's supposedly coming to the end. Um, what do you think we've seen? What's the experience in the UK? I mean, you obviously have a view on it. What did we see from this big neoliberal experiment in the last, say, 14 years or so, even before that?
One of the most overused phrases in economics is "this time it's different." And we simply reuse the same thing and then say, oh, but this time it's different. We've learned the mistakes of the past, and then we very expensively relearn the mistakes of the past again, and then we say, but this time it's different, and then we sort of rinse and repeat, in some kind of hope that things will be different this time round, and they're not. Um, and what we've learned, as you say, and it was a very good list you pulled together of the sort of the kind of some of the core tenets of kind of neoliberal economics that are found around the world. Financialization, individualization, the removal of community or collective rights, the idea that the state's key role is to sort of step away and allow individuals full liberty, over their jobs, their rights, everything else, is that not only does it not work, um, but that the winners don't outweigh the losers. That a few people benefit enormously, often stratospherically, but that many individuals then lose. Many individuals suffer as a consequence. And if we look at the proportion of the economy going to wages and salaries since 1991 in New Zealand, that's got less and less and less every year. The proportion of the economy going to capital goes up every year,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what we're seeing is the kind of real life example of um, uh, this time it's different. This time we hope and we pray that we cut taxes and somehow it will stimulate growth. That growth will deliver new employment, and that new employment will deliver prosperity. Well, we've cut taxes and the economy's gone into recession. Um, Unemployment's rising. But at the next election, I promise you, as sure as eggs is eggs, the solution will be, it's been really hard. You've done the mahi. Now it's time for a treat. Have another tax cut. And we'll just go round and round and round again.
I think
Whereas,
a lot
you
of people
know,
agree with that prediction. We're starting to see, it's lolly time next year, to kind of reward us all, but with the same, what they call like zombie policies that are dead but still walking. Uh,
and yeah, and that idea that somehow, um, you know, b- b- if we somehow make people more in this, there's a phrase which annoys me, which is more resilient. We make people more resilient, which means we put more of the burden on them.
mm,
That somehow that will benefit them.
yeah.
Whereas we never ask the same of businesses. We never ask the same of high net wealth individuals. We do everything that we possibly can to make sure they're comfortable
Mm,
in a country.
let's go. Um, right back at the beginning of the sort of the neoliberal political order, Maggie Thatcher once said, there is no alternative. And she said, there is no society. And but really, we have a heap of choices. We talked about a lot of those choices tonight. Um, and we really do live in a society, it's a really vibrant and interesting society in New Zealand. Do you have a vision for what, as neoliberalism dies eventually and goes away, what's coming next? What kind of political order we might have afterwards, that New Zealand can make, and what kind of choices can New Zealand make to free itself from all this stuff that just doesn't work for us?
Well, um, forgive me for a small advert. Although I'm here tonight in a personal capacity, the CTU has been doing a whole bunch of work around reimagining Aotearoa Together, which is doing exactly that. What does a good society look like? What does a good economy look like? What are the problems that workers face, and how might we have policies that re-enfranchise those workers and give them some power and some voice and some agency inside their futures? Because many of the problems that bedevil economies in New Zealand and around the rest of the world are actually about workers feeling as if they've got no agency. People feeling as if they've got no agency, no choice. Arguably, that's why Donald Trump was so successful in the US, because there were a whole bunch of people who said, I feel left behind. And how do we give people some sense that they have some control, some security over their lives? And so much of our policy settings have to go on, how do we restore that sense of security? How do we restore that sense of agency? How do we make work work? How do we make the sense of progress and prosperity return? And not just for the lucky few who we can watch on TV or on YouTube, but for everyone. There's a great Aneurin Bevan phrase, which is, "We're all better off when we're all better off." And there's in a part of the core role of progressive parties, whichever ones you happen to believe in, should be to say, how do we deliver that change? Not just how do we tinker with the settings in order to make things temporarily better off. Now, the kinds of future that's in front of us, there are several, potential futures in front of us. One of which is we just carry on with where we are, and we return to the kind of economy that we had, during the 2010s, where we slip ever further behind other countries in the world. We pretend that when overseas economists call us a rock star economy, that it means something. And that we rely more and more on low value tourism, on dairy, on forestry, and we don't deliver the kind of economy that has any sustainability. We can choose a different path where we choose to make investments, we choose to grow the economy, but that will require a fundamentally different approach to how we tax, how we spend, the role of the government inside the economy. And that will be hard, because that's not something that comes easily to countries over time. And then lastly, we can become an economy, as in my hope, right, where we actually put people at the center of our decision-making matrix, not at the edge. We don't put GDP in the middle, because GDP is a number. We don't put inflation at the middle. Inflation is a number. We don't put maintaining existing prosperity in the middle, because that prosperity can be distributed very unevenly. We put people in the middle, and we maximize their well-being. We maximize the well-being of our kids. We maximize the well-being of our communities. And I put it to you: if we had an economy that was delivering great economic well-being, economic security, people felt comfortable, secure. They felt they could, they had some agency in the future. We'd actually care a lot less about what the GDP number was, because it would be meaningless. It wouldn't have any value to us. Instead, we'd care about actually continuing to deliver the policies that were maximising the benefits for New Zealanders and maximising the benefits for our kids in Mokopuna in the future.
Craig, that's been fantastic. I've really found all of your input and conversation tonight very valuable, and I'm sure the audience will think the same way. We have so many choices we could make, and we've got choices that we really should make. And I think you've really shone a light on a lot of them tonight. So I just wanted to thank you very much for doing this podcast here with me and the G News audience. And I really hope that we will see you again sometime soon.
I'm delighted to help, Jared, and delighted to talk to you whenever is useful or helpful to you, because I always like to leave audiences at the moment with this in front of us. I love numbers, as you can tell. It's how I work. 1st of November 2026, which is my guess for when there'll be an election. That's 608 days away. We have 608 days in order to make that difference, so that the public knows what's at stake at the next election. And whichever party you vote for the party that's actually going to deliver the kind of positive change that we want to see. But we have a really short window in which to have that conversation with everyone. So we can't waste a single day.
Every day counts.
Every day counts.
Thank you very much, Craig. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Welcome to G News, the good news.